and welcome to the special edition of Africa Amplified. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg. For the next half hour, we're shining the spotlight on South Africa as it prepares for the most important elections since the ANC took power in 1994. All right, here's a little bit of background. The economy has stalled, growing less than 1% per annum over the past decade. At 32%, unemployment is rampant, and so is poverty, crime, and corruption. Inequality is also rising, and living costs are high. Not just that, the rand has been the worst performing major currency since President Cyril Ramaphosa took power in 2018. Public finances are also squeezed. South Africans here have endured almost daily blackouts after decades of underinvestment in dilapidated power plants, while road, rail, and port infrastructure are collapsing. So it's no wonder then that as we approach the May 29th election, the ANC's rule and a second term for President Ramaphosa are under threat. We've been taking a look at opinion polls. They're suggesting the party could lose its parliamentary majority for the first time. And a record number of political parties are contesting the upcoming elections. I think last time I counted it was upwards of 380, but only a handful are serious challengers. The main opposition, Democratic Alliance, and several smaller rivals have established a business-friendly bloc aiming to form a coalition government. Then there's also the left-leaning Economic Freedom Fighters, which has steadily increased its share of the vote. The big unknown, though, is the newly formed MK Party, backed by former President Jacob Zuma. And as the politicians campaign, it's ultimately going to come down to the 28 million registered voters to determine South Africa's future. That is why we are focusing on it today. That is the context, and there's a lot to unpack. So let's unpack it now, unpack all of it now with our team covering the election in Cape Town and also here in the economic hub of South Africa, Johannesburg. We are joined by Bloomberg's uMkhonto Takwana and also John Viljoen, who is in Cape Town with us. John, uMkhonto, thanks so much for being here. John, let's just start with you. You are our markets editor in Cape Town. You've been paying close attention to what the markets are doing leading up to this election. I mean, how are they performing leading up? Is the anxiety already being felt, or are we still seeing investors really sitting on the sidelines right now?
Yeah, morning, Jennifer. Well, South African assets have actually done quite well recently. In April, the South African stock market rose for the second month in a row, and actually what came close to having its best month since November. And the rand was one of the best performing emerging market currencies. So those were positive signs, but it's also clear that investors are watching news flow around the election very closely. Bank of America does a monthly survey of fund managers here. And in the latest one, the risk of a shift to the left in government policy came out as the top risk, the biggest single risk identified by fund managers. And investors are also keeping a close eye on those opinion polls that you mentioned. In the latest major poll on April 26, it was interpreted by investors as being a market-friendly indicator, and the rand performed very strongly on that day. So I would say there's calm in the markets for now, but definitely some anxiety lingering in the background.
Yeah, it's always calm for now. We never really know where the rand is going, right? Let's bring in uMkhonto. She's sitting right next to me. uMkhonto, John was just going through a lot of the different scenarios that investors are planning for. I mean, what is this level of uncertainty really going to mean for this economy that's already been struggling, as we mentioned, post-May 29th?
Well, Jen, the financial markets have never had to deal with this level of political uncertainty that we're seeing now over the past 30 years. And it's given rise to economic uncertainty as well about what kind of government we will see at the end of on the other side of the May 29 election. And Moody's Investors Service yesterday saying that the emergence of a coalition government will likely mean that the implementation of key reforms that are currently taking place will slow down. And that's not good for a country that really is desperate to implement those key reforms. We've got a logistical crisis and an energy crisis that needs a decisive government to deal with those issues. We've got an employment crisis. We've got a growth, an economic growth crisis. And the longer those remain a problem and they aren't resolved, the longer the credit worthiness of South Africa is a problem. So those are the key uncertainties that people are worried about.
John, give us your insight too, because you're down in Cape Town. You speak to a number of investors as well as uMkhonto. I mean, Is all of this uncertainty really creating a lot of concern for investors post-election, or are they just waiting for May 29th to really make any sort of definitive move one way or the other?
Yes, it's all going to come down to how those votes stack up. If we avoid the scenario of an unpredictable coalition government, things could be quite positive. That Bank of America survey I mentioned earlier, for example, showed that 70% of the fund managers that they spoke to here in South Africa actually expect a rally in South African shares after the election. For the rand, the election is obviously a huge risk event. That a shift to the left in policy could be very bad news for the currency. On the other hand, if we avoid that scenario, that could be positive. Either way, it comes down to how the votes stack up. For example, yesterday, strategists at Credit Agricole said that they are quite positive about the rand for the rest of the year. But just given how close it is to the election and the uncertainty of the outcome, they are staying on the sidelines of the market while they monitor the news flow.
And Tondo, just really quickly, I mean, what do you think is maybe the biggest risk scenario here come May 29th?
I mean, the best scenario is a scenario where the ANC remains the main policy driver. But there are scenarios where, say, for instance, it falls to 40%. Then there's a real risk that it has to bring in a party that has a bit of heft. And that's going to mean that we're going to see a lot more policy changes that are going to have a bearing on the management of public finances. So either the ANC manages to remain the policy driver and we won't see any big shifts, or it needs just a little bit to help it reach over 50% to form a coalition government, and even in that instance we won't see a huge policy shift. But in the instance that it does show a dramatic drop, then we do face a risk of it having to tap for someone much bigger and someone who maybe would challenge them for key posts maybe, or key areas that is probably not aligned with the ANC's ideologies and its main and current policies.
Of course, and that gets to the point where people are concerned that nothing's going to get done, right? Because there's a lot of political infighting. We have to leave it there. Bloomberg reporters John Viljoen out of Cape Town and, of course, Ntando Tukwana here in Johannesburg with me. Thank you both so much for joining us. All right, coming up, we'll discuss South Africa's changing political landscape with political commentator and Bloomberg Opinion columnist Justice Malala. He is here in studio with me as well. Stick with us. This is Bloomberg.
Today we're saying that this ANC is also straitjacketed because it's bought. It has been influenced by,
You said board?
It is bought, yes. Cyril Ramaphosa is the first president of this country since 1912 to have earned his presidency by way of billions of rands being funded, being behind his presidency.
That was the spokesperson for the newly formed MK party itself. Not without controversy. He was speaking with us just a bit ago. Now, that criticism you heard leveled at President Cyril Ramaphosa follows a number of questions about his business interests. Despite the president's credentials as a former anti-apartheid activist, opposition parties are often attacking his personal wealth in one of the most unequal countries in the world. So here's a quick look at Ramaphosa's unusual rise to power. On the day anti-apartheid hero Nelson Mandela was freed from 27 years of prison, he was the man at his side. Cyril Ramaphosa was the future Nobel Peace Prize winner's favorite to succeed him as president of South Africa and the ruling party. But this was not to be Ramaphosa's moment in the political spotlight, as he was overlooked by the ANC. Instead, he became a businessman, acquiring stakes in nearly every key sector of the country's economy, from mining to telecoms to fast food. As a result, he became one of the country's wealthiest individuals. Yet 19 years after the ANC first overlooked him, Ramaphosa returned to politics. Elected president in 2018,
I will be faithful to the Republic of South Africa.
He appointed market-friendly technocrats to his cabinet. the market reaction was euphoric. Ramaphosa had officially arrived. The new president promised to revitalize the economy and root out corruption. But the one-time trade union boss turned millionaire businessman struggled to live up to the economic hopes and expectations placed on him in his first term, even as he looked to carve out a role for South Africa on the global stage. Unemployment sits at 32%, GDP growth hovers at 1%, and the rand has been the worst performing major currency during his time in office. The outcome of the May elections may impact Ramaphosa's market-friendly policies. It may equally define his legacy by way of comparison to his one-time mentor. Let's bring in Justice Malala, South African political analyst and also Bloomberg Opinion contributor. Justice, thank you so much for being here. It's really an honor to sit with you. So we were just talking about President Ramaphosa's ascent to power, unusual ascent to power. I mean, how would you assess the past few years of his presidency? I mean, does it represent what the ANC is to this country?
I would say the past 5-6 years of his presidency is, it's been a disaster, but, and it's a big but, President Ramaphosa has the right idea, has the right policy trajectory. If you think about what all the people looking at South Africa right now, Ramaphosa represents that which is stable and the trajectory looks like it could go up. The problem is that he got into power in 2018, 2019, and he sat on his hands. He didn't implement all the fantastic stuff that he said he would implement. So in many ways, the right guy for the job, but actually the CEO who sits in his office and doesn't implement.
Wow. And I mean, we're talking about a country that needs implementation more than anything.
Absolutely.
I want to turn to this opinion column you wrote, Justice, because you were pretty pointed in saying earlier this year, unless the opposition ousts the ANC comprehensively, coalition permutations after the election hold a significant risk of dysfunction. I mean, give us best and worst case scenarios here.
I think right now, possibly the worst case scenario for South Africa would be the ANC going below 40%.
Worst case scenario?
Possibly. I would say right now, for certainty, for the risk premium, so the ANC goes below 40. The ANC is forced into coalition with the left-leaning EFF. In my view, that would lead to several weeks of just pandemonium. What happens next? Are we going to have expropriation without compensation, nationalization of the central bank, all these policy ideas that have been put forward by the EFF? The ANC will be on the back foot, and it will need to accommodate this partner that it might have. I think that's with these elections, that's on the extreme. My scenario, my most likely scenario would be an ANC that gets around 45% and can build coalitions with smaller parties. I would say many of the smaller parties are amenable to a tie-up with the ANC. I would say the IFP, others are open to that sort of tie-up. You mustn't forget the ANC actually has a long history of doing these coalitions. At the moment, possibly the one in your intro earlier on, the one aspect of this economy that's working is tourism. Not perfectly, but it's working. And the minister in that portfolio is actually an opposition member. So the ANC already has these smaller parties around it.
Let's also bring in the Jacob Zuma factor, because that's what I'm going to call it right now, and the MK party. We briefly mentioned it earlier. This has really been the wild card for this election. And you also wrote about how he's really winning the PR war against the ANC. But does that actually translate on May 29th? Do you think we're actually going to see him coming back?
If he can hold it together for the next 4 weeks, yes, I think that he'll make an impact. He's making a big impact in rural KwaZulu-Natal. He projects himself as this traditional big leader, traditional values and so forth. Very, for your viewers, very Trumpian, says whatever he likes to say. And I think if he brings the ANC take down in KwaZulu-Natal, where he's one of the most popular leaders. In fact, polls have found that he's the most popular leader in that province. That means a drop in support for the ANC nationally, and that has implications. So Jacob Zuma if the implosion and the scandals that are surround his party do not derail his campaign in the next 4 weeks, will be a player in our politics.
I mean, they didn't derail, his ability to come back into politics, right, over the past few years.
No, they didn't. But if he is seen as this one-person gig, then it becomes, is it really worth going with him? Even ANC supporters who were thinking, there's opportunity for us here, start thinking, no, maybe we step back a little bit. I think it don't derail him completely, but I think he's got quite a lot going on with the internal shenanigans in his party.
Does it have implications, no matter what we see come May 29th, whether it's Zuma, the MK party, ANC? I mean, is this election going to have implications, you think, on future elections here in South Africa?
Yeah, I think the trend is one of, we're seeing the end of a liberation movement. People like me grew up, the ANC is the big kahuna, Nelson Mandela comes to power, the meaning of change. Most liberation movements have a 30-year lifespan after liberation itself. And the ANC is right, bang on 30 years. It's, I think the ANC is essentially looking at smaller and smaller returns. The next election, 2029, in my view, will be the election that finally shifts the ANC from being the center of power in South Africa to a more democratic space. A noisier place, probably, but one where South African voters make a decisive decision to move elsewhere. Left or right, we can have that debate.
Yeah, we did have our editor-in-chief, John Micklethwaite, pointing that out, that, if anything, this is showing the democratic process is somewhat working here in South Africa.
No, absolutely. And I would say the institutions are working, some of them.
Some of them. We have to leave it there. Justice Malala, a political analyst and also Bloomberg Opinion contributor, thank you so much for being here. It was really great to speak with you. All right, coming up, we're going to discuss the mood of investors ahead of the election and what it could mean for the Rand with Citi South African economist Gina Schoeman. Stick with us. This is Bloomberg. Investors and traders are keeping a close eye on political developments here in South Africa. Some are worried, as we've been speaking about for the past few minutes, that a left-leaning coalition could unsettle the markets and put further strain on the volatile Rand. Let's discuss all of this with Gina Schoeman. She is a South Africa economist at Citibank. So, Gina, you've been spending a lot of time talking to international investors. What would you say is their top worry here?
Hi, Jennifer. So it's definitely a radical outcome for this election. So easy way to interpret that would be a coalition with the EFF and also the inclusion of MK, if possible. But it's that radical outcome that investors are so concerned about, because, of course, that would have very negative implications for the currency, but also very negative implications for corporates on the ground in South Africa.
What is that worst case scenario? I mean, we were talking to Justice about it briefly. I mean, from an economic perspective, what do you see as potentially being the most detrimental to this economy?
Well, it seems as if that 45% outcome for the ANC is a very comfortable spot for everyone. And I would almost argue that markets are starting to get a little bit more comfortable that the ANC is not going to fall below 40%. But there's still something about that 40% region, if that is the outcome, that investors aren't really sure about. They're worried about the EFF being too powerful and certain parts of the ANC coming out in favor of the EFF joining them. And the concern there is that, of course, the EFF has a manifesto that suggests radical change for this economy. So you can pick a number, I guess, for the currency. Very hard to guess what the risk premium would do on the news that the EFF was in a national coalition. And that's because they would have some type of national impact. Corporate South Africa would, of course, be very, very concerned. It would be very difficult for shareholders to try and accept CapEx plans, hiring intentions, if a radical party such as the EFF were part of national policy. And even if they were, even though we think that likelihood is very small, even if they weren't really that impactful, how long would investors have to live with that situation to get comfortable with the idea. We think quite a long time. So it really is a very radical outcome, but we do think it's got a small probability attached to it.
So then if we do see the ANC sort of maintaining that 40% majority, does things continue business as usual, or do you think we'll still see some instability for a little bit?
Well, it really does depend on what happens with the coalitions. However, outside the EFF and MK, it's difficult to see the ANC making a coalition with a party that is going to come with a dramatic impact, at least certainly in the beginning. The IFP, the DA, lots of smaller parties, they could make up that 51% threshold for the ANC if the ANC gets somewhere around 45%. 40% is more difficult. You'd have to see the DA probably come into the mix. But that type of impact the market has accepted is a relatively market-friendly. I think investors would still want to see what the cabinet looks like thereafter. And, of course, there's no timeline for that. But cabinet ministers and what happens to reform plans, certainly what happens to fiscal and monetary policy thereafter would be very, very important.
So then, Gina, just finally, I mean, what do you see as driving the RAND price action right now? Is it all elections, or are there other factors maybe at play here? Every day we're talking about where the RAND is going and where it's at.
Well, it was certainly the risk premium was dominated more, in our view, by election talk. Certainly around February when the MK party started coming to the polls. I would say now that some of that risk premium come down slightly, and there is also talk about commodity prices and monetary policy, given questions about when the Fed might cut, and also questions about whether the South Africa Reserve Bank is going to cut rates or not, given the discussion about a low inflation target. So it's not all about elections anymore. There's certainly talk about what happens after the elections, and certainly around commodity prices, and then, of course, monetary policy.
All right. Gina Schoeman, South Africa economist at Citi. Gina, always great to have you on. Thank you so much for your time this morning. All right, and that's all we have time for today, unfortunately. Join us again next month for much, much more news and analysis from across the African continent. And please continue to watch Bloomberg as we build up to the South African elections, of course, on May 29th. Plus, be sure to follow our weekly podcast. It's called Next Africa. You can catch it every Friday wherever you get your podcasts. For me, I'm Jennifer Zabasaja. That is it for this morning. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time.